So let's take this conversation to Davos now, where global markets are bracing for President Donald Trump's address at the World Economic Forum. Our business correspondent, Rolake Akinkunbi-Filani, is standing by in Davos with a closer look at the mood on the ground and what markets are expecting from today's speech. Rolake, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday. Now, markets have been on edge ahead of this speech. What are investors in Davos most anxious to hear from President Trump today?
Yeah, thank you very much. Great to be joining you there in the studio live here from Davos. As you can imagine, there's a lot of anticipation, and many of the American speakers from the government and administration have been here in Davos over the last 2 days. We had Commerce Secretary Lutnick. We also had U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who had gone ahead of Trump, almost like a forerunner, if you like, to try and quell turbulence in the market. You'd have seen over the last few days, bond markets, equities markets around the world have been really a bit turbulent. We saw a small rise in yields on U.S. Treasuries. And so I think investors are looking for sentiment and statements that will essentially say that geopolitical risk can actually be managed. And we know what the issues on the table are. Greenland, we can't deny that's on the table for discussion. And we also can't deny the fact that tariffs have really changed the world order insofar as the architecture around global trade multilateralism is concerned. Now, the mood here has been quite anticipatory. Just over in the distance to my right there, we're hearing protesters who are being kept at a distance by the security agency. Security itself has been very tight, unusually compared to the previous 2 days here at Davos. And I was in the hall earlier, just outside the Congress Hall. Hundreds of people and delegates have already congregated outside the hall, held back from the doors of the hall by security services. I believe they've been letting now. We expect that Trump's helicopter will land any time now, if it hasn't already landed. And that speech is expected to take place at 2:30 p.m. West Africa time. So the mood is anticipatory. Markets expect statements that will bring some relief. But, you know, with Donald Trump, the message is don't hold your breath.
That is exactly it. And from a business perspective, how serious are concerns about Trump's tariff threats and their potential impact on global trade and the supply chains?
Well, I think the tariff threats predated the Greenland dispute, the tariff issue. We saw at the start of his second term in office over a year ago now, where he started the Liberation Day push for increasing tariffs across the key economic blocs, across the key superpowers. I don't think there were many nations who were exempt from that onslaught, if you like. And what they said, countries to come to the negotiating table. And, you know, the American doctrine around tariffs is essentially America first, even though Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, has said America first doesn't mean America alone. But it's hard to imagine collaboration if the U.S. administration is digging its heels in. And really, the rationale around this, as highlighted by administration officials, is that the U.S. has a fiscal deficit. It has a debt problem that it's been trying to deal with for many years. The current target for the fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP for the U.S. administration is 3% by the end of the Trump administration. Now, if they have to achieve that, they have to fund the spending and the budget somehow. And so there's a deep linkage between the tariff onslaught and U.S. domestic priorities. But of course, as you know, tariffs as an economic tool also have wider geopolitical repercussions. And many nations have also said they would retaliate. The majority appear to have come to the negotiating table. The final point I will make on this is, interestingly, it seems like many of the America's domestic economic issues will be on the table in Trump's speech. You've heard many talk about the fact that housing affordability is a concern in the US, and it seems like America will also bring that to the table. So we really don't know which way this will go, but the truth is tariffs have had an impact on global sentiment. We haven't seen as much of an impact on key commodities such as oil because there are other factors driving that. But insofar as market sentiment is, at the initial stage of this tariff regime, we did see markets really tumble across board, but there's been a pricing correction and some relative stability since. But over the last few days, obviously, with the Greenland dispute and the tensions with Europe, markets have once again become a bit turbulent.
So how are European companies and investors reacting to the renewed focus on Greenland and the strain it's putting on US-EU relations?
Well, you know, US-EU relations are really encapsulated in the NATO alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's one of the biggest geopolitical alliances, military alliances in the world, if not the biggest. And it has stood the test of time over decades. And this is the first major fracture in the NATO alliance for decades. Even though the US has said, you know, the NATO alliance is safe and sound, the Europeans don't think so. We heard the very strong words from President Emmanuel Macron just yesterday on day 2 of Davos, where he said that the push by the Americans is not in keeping with the values of global cooperation amongst allies. And he's actually threatened, as a spokesperson for the European Union, he's threatened retaliation. Now, the form of that retaliation is something that is not entirely clear. The European Union and many of the bigger economies have suggested additional tariffs on the Americans, as well as, of course, the countries that have sent troops to Greenland, Denmark, France, the UK, and others will bear the brunt of the American tariff push, which will commence from the 1st of February, a 10% tariff on those European countries to be increased to 25% if they don't back down. Now, we expect perhaps Trump to hint at something around that today, but I must say that it is very possible that their planned closed-door negotiations between European allies and the Trump administration, it's not entirely clear to those of us here at Davos whether there is a plan for that. It's possible that he might just get back on his helicopter and Air Force One and scoot back over to Washington, D.C. So that remains to be seen. But it's very clear that the Europeans are not going to sit back and watch this what is essentially an upheaval in the alliance take place without some very strong statements and, more importantly, some strong action.
And Rolake, beyond the headlines, what are the signals? What other signals will markets be watching for most closely during the address? Trump's address, his tone, his policy specifics, geopolitical posturing. What are we going to be looking out for?
Well, I will definitely say that the U.S. housing issue is a key signal for investors. And the reason I say so is that the U.S. housing market is tied to broader market sentiment around the availability of credit and the availability of mortgages. And I argue, in fact, that the reason such a very domestic issue is on the table at an international platform is for that very linkage, right? Because U.S. credit markets have been squeezed in recent times, and that has trickled down to mortgage affordability, especially for the bottom end of the spectrum in the American market. So I think that will be one of the signals. We also expect maybe some vague reference or direct references to Latin America. Of course, the capture of Maduro, which took place almost 3 weeks ago, could be on the table. And that statements around what will happen in the Latin American axis and the impact on oil production could also be another factor. The global oil market is already well oversupplied, so it's not likely that any statements by Trump here will move prices up or down either way, but at least that will be another price watch for investors. And of course, watch US Treasuries and the bond market. Where is the yield curve going and the impact that will ultimately have on rates? The final thing I will say is the issue around the independence of the US Federal Reserve. As you know, Jerome Powell is due to end his term later this year. The question of who will take over, whether the new the new Fed chair will be hawkish or dovish in terms of monetary policy. They will want to be avoiding a slowdown risk for the US economy. So the issue of rates, which the Trump administration has waded into in an unprecedented fashion, actually, in the history of me following US politics and political economy, has raised questions about the independence of the Fed. And that is a key signal for investors as well, because the sanctity of monetary policy is something that is globally accepted and is a consensus.
Well, very interesting discussion there. Our business correspondent, Rolake Akinkunbi Filani, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday.